please. So, without further ado, can I ask you to give a big round of applause to Professor Charles Hopkins.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, with no further ado, right? Great. It's wonderful to be here with you this morning. It's always a little awkward because I think this is the 10th time that I have been with you and asked to give a keynote. So I pretty well ran out of everything I knew about the second one, and go from there. Just for my own knowledge, how many of you have never heard me before? Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Now, you other old-timers, just be quiet and go have a coffee. No, good. I'm thinking, the Learning Teacher Network early on made a decision that, as well as the breadth, that the Learning Teacher Network also wanted to delve into new and emerging areas. And the new and emerging area at that time was education for sustainable development. And so it became sort of a specialty that has grown within the network, and the reputation of the Learning Teacher Network, to the point where UNESCO recognized it as a key partner in the Global Action Program. And so then it emerged, because that's sort of my area that I do a lot of work in, that I would come and sort of update and talk about it. So forgive me, but this morning I'm going to be talking more about the role of education for sustainable development, what is happening with sustainable development, and then sort of end up with posing the question about the future of the Learning Teacher Network and its relationship to ESD. So that's sort of the gist that I want to work on. Now, I want to pick up where our first speaker, Lukatov, left off. He gave a brilliant overview of all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I just wish I could have been there with him afterwards and talking to them. There's so many stories behind the scene. Right at the very last minute, people were going to sign it, and the U.S. ambassador refused and said, you have to remove the word extreme poverty, or put in extreme poverty, because they did not want to be singled out, that they would actually have to do something with their poor and homeless, So there's always behind the scenes. I've been involved a number of times, and there's always there. The new aspect, though, is we got pretty used to talking about people, planet, profit. We talked about environment and society and economy. What has happened in this last round is we've gone from 3 to 5, and we've become cute, and we've put it all in P's. Okay. But at any rate, the environment is now planet, and prosperity is economy. We all hope. And planet, of course, is the old environment. But we've added 2 more things. One being peace. And within that, human rights, peace, social justice, that whole aspect. Because we realize that we cannot really attain a sustainable future without addressing that. And this is not just North Korea and the others. Yeah, to a certain extent. But it's also addressing domestic peace. It is about Miramar, right? It is about your own neighborhoods. It is about social justice within our communities. So that whole concept of peace is much broader. And the idea of partnership really came forward because there was the expectation, even from Rio in '92, there was the expectation that governments could do this. We'd just sit back and the governments would pass a law and all would be well. And we realized, no, that's not how it happens. We all have to go in and do our bit. No one can do it all, but everybody can do something. Whether you're a custodian in the school, you know, and looking after the recycling or whatever, and so right up if you're mayor of a community, wherever, we all can do something. But it's developing these partnerships. Too often we have an organization and say, oh, well, we deal with racism, we don't deal with environment, you know, and even the clubs within a school can be, you know, at odds with one another. We have to start looking bigger. We have to see the bigger picture and see where's our expertise and how does this link with others. So I think that these are two very, very important components. But this is the big picture that we're still struggling with, you know, trying to create an economic system, because at the heart of sustainable development is the word development. And this has proved to be a problem over the years, because so many people think of development as getting bigger and bigger and continual growth and so on. I wear a watch, but the first timepiece probably would fill a tenth of this room. Then you see the great huge ones, and most of you, I would assume, it's a chip on your computer. We don't have to necessarily, we can think of complexity, we can think of reducing the emissions of a Prius, or now a whole electric car, depending on where it gets its electricity. It can be much less than the cars of the 50s and 60s. So we have to be thinking about development in the terms of biomimicry. How can we develop in a way that is parallel and we learn from how it is done in nature? Right? So it's a different way of looking at it. But through it all, we need some kind of an economic system that is socially just. And I bolded all because I'm not limiting it to humans. When we talk about all, we're talking about all living things. I think it's important. Now, one of the big issues is that when we talk about partnerships and we talk about all, is the problem that not everyone feels it in the same way. It's about them. It's about others. The big difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them, and Agenda 21, which preceded the Millennium Development Goals, these are 15-year sequences, is that the Sustainable Development Goals apply to all countries. Now, I know when they were developing, I talked to the head of the Canadian delegation and the US delegation, and at the beginning they were all saying, well, yes, but you know, it's not really us. But by the end, when they realized that non-government organizations and so on were going to be holding their feet to the fire, and it's important really to understand. But there's some good news. Around the Sustainable Development Goals, still at this point, it's like a new marriage. You know, people are kind of up, because for the first time, before they even signed the Sustainable Development Goals, the foreign minister, or the finance ministers, met in Addis Ababa from around the world and pledged roughly $4 trillion per year to try and address it. Now, much of that that money will be spent at home. So the Danish government is spending money here on doing it, but it's counted in that. It's not just foreign aid. Some of it is foreign aid. But all countries now, in trying to reach the targets that are set on those, are working towards it. The corporate world is aligning. You saw what happened when Trump went to, still, well, I might be in the climate change, I might not, and so on. I'm glad he's out. I am, because it really united the rest of the world. When you look at his overall impact of pulling out, it's not that great, because the states individually are in. It's pretty amazing. The big corporations all stood up and said, no, we're in. And that is really counts. And the other thing that has come forward is higher education. Higher education has just come out with an accord, and it is being passed around the world, signing up. The higher education institutions played a big part in Paris and will play an even bigger part in Bonn. Thousands of universities and colleges and applied science and so on have all signed an accord to work on sustainability. The importance of higher education is this. Roughly 6%, 5, maybe 6, of the world's population gets to go to higher education. It's very small, very small. But those 5 or 6% will become 80% of the decision makers, and they will shape the world. They will become the heads of state. They will become the heads of the corporations. They will be in media. They'll be our artists, the poets, the writers. They will be the shapers. The heads of religious, faith-based groups. These are an extremely important target. And so it's so important to think of how we can reshape education for sustainable development so that it reaches all who go through higher education. It's not an elective that we put into the environment program. No, somehow we have to rethink, revisit, rethink how we are going to deliver the message of achieving a more sustainable future. Now, we visit them all, and I want us to focus and drill down on the education target. It links with others, but it's extremely important. And I want to do it largely from a big picture, but one thing you can do on Monday morning, we always say, wow, what do I do Monday morning? Right? You can have a birthday party. The SDGs will be 2 years old Monday morning. So go in, talk to the students, and say, remember this day, this little thing was born 2 years ago. It's not very effective, it's not very good, but it will be a determining part of your life. And, and sort of think along that line. The big difference with these sustainable development goals is if you read this one, the overarching goal is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Wow, how aspirational. You never see something like this, coming out. If you were to put this forward within your authority, your education authority, and say, what the hell? How are you going to measure, right? How are you going to measure inclusive? What it will be? How are you going to measure equitable? How are you going to measure quality? And so it's loaded with this kind of aspirational level. But if we don't have that kind of a vision and where we're going, we won't get there. We'll fall into the realm of the bean counters and depression and so on. So this is the overall aspect of where we want to go. Now the key features of it is beyond that it is seen that education really is a public right. And we really have to focus on those countries where there is no school for the children at all. That is an extremely important. Or the quality of that education is so very, very poor that after 2 years they leave. The idea of expanded access, and when I show you the 7 components of number 4, then you will see again that it applies to all countries at all levels: preschool, higher education, lifelong learning. It applies to technical and vocational education, the gymnasiums, and so on, the whole breadth. It's about educating our entire society. And a whole thing about on quality. What is emerging, and I'll talk to you again later, is that there has been, when I've visited ministries of education and so on around the world and talking about it, there has been this clash between, well, ESD sounds nice, but PISA is what we have to address. Everyone's concerned about PISA. What is this going to do with our PISA? I can't go to my teachers and say, forget about PISA and now do this. And I'm saying, you don't. They work together. And I will come back to them. You know, 2 different things. One is the focus on math and language. The other is the purpose of education. So that's where we're going. So within SDG 4, we have 7 targets and 3 means of implementation. And we have the world is still struggling over the indicators. What are we going to actually use as indicators? And so we will have some global indicators, and then we will have national indicators, and we'll have local indicators that would be set, you know, by your own community, your own local authority, and so on. And we try to come up with the measures. Now, so I say there's 7. The first, 4.1, gets back to where we were back in the late 1980s. When we were trying to figure out, I was one of the authors of Agenda 21. There were 10 of us, and 4 of us came in with an environmental education background, but I was a school superintendent, so I could see the bigger picture, but in my heart was environment. And so we were thinking, okay, let's look at this sustainable development as an environmental thing and so on. And the president of Princeton University in the United States said, we just need better recycling in our schools. We need really, really good recycling programs. And the dean of the Faculty of Education in Cairo said, I have several 100,000 students who are very, very good at recycling. These were children who lived in the dumps of Cairo. They need an education. And suddenly it really twigged with us that we couldn't just look at adding, environmental education 2.0. That was not going to solve the big picture. It would be a crucial component, just like adding development education, improving language, all of these components. But we had to see it in a much bigger picture. This whole thing about, in the Millennium Development Goals, we were asking for 6 years of access to 6 years of education. That was the target for everybody. We didn't achieve it. In fact, it's about flat, that 9% of the world's population, the children of the world don't have any school at all, let alone really get anywhere. Now the aspiration is both elementary and secondary, although the secondary is only to grade 10. So, but at any rate, that is a huge step forward. The next one is access to early childhood care. So for those of you who are working in this area, see what I want to show in this is that this applies to every teacher. Every one of you looking through will find a niche and an important way in which you can contribute and in which you can become a resource person within your authority, knowing, first of all, the big picture, but also having expertise in a particular area, and then linking with others. The third one is really important, and that's access to technical, vocational, tertiary, and university, affordable universities, and so on. Some of you already have that, but for others it's a dream. In particular, the skills for employment and entrepreneurship, 4.3 and 4.4 go together. I'm working a lot now with the UNIVOC, the United Nations Vocational Education and Training, because big corporations really get the idea of sustainability, but they have a vice president sustainability, they have money for training of staff and so on. Small to medium-sized enterprise, which makes up the vast majority, over 95% of enterprise is small to medium-sized business. They don't have that. So what we need to do is to go in and reorient our technical and vocational education so that the workforce coming out from them will have the ability, not only the skills of greening our small to medium-sized enterprise, but they will have the interpersonal skills to become a leader and to have additional certification for leadership in the workforce. Because we desperately need to come up with a strategy of reorienting that. When we get to 4.5, that one I think will strike the hearts with many of you, and looking at try to improve the lives for our most vulnerable. The research that I'm starting to do now, with all this past year, it's in 35 countries, about 70 sites, and looking at how we can use education for sustainable development to improve the lives and the education of Indigenous and marginalized youth. These are the ones who are least well served all around the world, and but that whole grouping, I think many of you work with marginalized and disadvantaged and so on, the inner city. That's an important one. The gender disparities. Then youth and adults, the whole thing around adult education. I mean, we still have almost 1 billion people who are illiterate in the world. That are those of you who work in adult education. It's crucial. And then the seventh one, 4.7, is knowledge and skill for sustainable development, and in that is global citizenship and so on. And I'll come back to that, because that's, at this point, I say it's mistaken, and in talking with UNESCO, I think there's a chance that we will be able to actually change. But this seventh one on its own is wrong. Education for sustainable development is all of these. And by putting it separate like this, and last on the list, it is a misconception. This is thinking of it as sustainability education and not education itself for sustainable development. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm trying to leave time for questions and discussion. Now, so if we go back and sort of look at that, at each of these just for a little bit, that 4.1, demanding all children complete primary and secondary, now we've agreed that to measure that, there will be 3 3 measurements over time. Grade 2 or 3 at the end of primary, again at the end of lower secondary, in grades 2 or 3, and then at the end of primary education, which is usually 6, something like that, and then either 9 or 10. Trying to get countries to agree on some sort of overall standard is very difficult, but once again, they're saying, let's only measure reading and mathematics. It's a start. It's a start because we already have some standardized tests. You know, the OECD is now developing PISA for developing countries, so that it doesn't look quite so bad when you start looking at places like Taiwan, where 15% of GDP by law goes to education. In Canada, it's 3%. In the United States, 2.8%. So the inequities around the world. But if we look at the whole thing around quality, there's the figure more than 617 million children and adolescents are not achieving any kind of quality in reading and mathematics. 6 out of 10 children and adolescents are not achieving minimum proficiency. This is statistics I found last night. You can see it's September. This is the UN statistics. If you want to follow blogs and tweets and so on, get into the UN statistics, because about every second or third day there's really good up-to-date information coming, so that when you talk with your fellow colleagues or talk to your administration, you'll be able to be up to date. But this focusing on reading and math, countries that really focus in on the drill and kill on that without looking at the really big picture of education, usually it doesn't show any improvement. All it does is it frustrates the teachers, it frustrates, because so many children in the world they never make the step from learning to read to reading to learn. You know, they can decode, but they're not doing it. So in looking at that bigger picture, what I usually think of are the stages. You would have your own, but when I was superintendent of curriculum, I had sort of this bigger framework that I wanted to put forward. In the very early years, just the love of learning, right? Loving school and loving the idea of being able to explore. And then after that, the second stage, well, what is there to learn? Bits and pieces, whether it's nature or books or exploring or stories, all of them, multifaceted way of what is out there. And then from that next stage of learning how to learn, where do I find material? How can I find what I want? How can I remember it? What is best for me to and then learning for purpose. Instead of just wandering around, it's okay, here's a task, I have to learn about this. How can I do that? How can I learn with others? Who do I go to learn? What kind of resources? That whole aspect and preparing. And then one of the biggest steps of all is for them to assume the responsibility for themselves. Most students, even way up into secondary school, teach me. Is it going to be on the exam? Do I have to learn this? You know, so that isn't, you don't overcome that by drilling in math. You know? This has to be a whole strategy, you know, to move that. And to realize, you know, how I can remember in grade 10, and most students left. There were 200, a little over 200 of us when I went to this small high school village. 200 entered into grade 9, and 7 of us graduated. Most when it came to grade 10, God, I don't have to learn anything anymore, you know, and without, and we're driving truck in the lumber industry or what we're doing. But the idea of becoming lifelong learners is so very, very important. So somehow, in our quest for good PISA scores, we need to be continuing with the big one. Now, PISA is not the enemy. PISA does report on much broader things. I'm being a little cruel and a little harsh on PISA. The problem is that the press only looks at a couple of indicators. Where do we stand? You know, if it's Denmark, how do we stand with Finland and Norway and you know, yeah, and if it's Canada, then we always look and say, oh, we've slipped one. Because a lot of the Asians now are putting in just their one city. You know, you have Hong Kong, Singapore, Beijing, and they target, and so they take some of the first top spots. But anyway, it's keeping our vision on the big one. Now, for many, it isn't only a question of pedagogy and how we teach. For many, it is just so unequal, and we have to keep that in our mind as we go on. I was, earlier this year, I was in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is the point where about 9%. We keep adding more children in school, but it's at the same as the birth rate. So we still end up, you know, with 9% for whom there are none. Earlier, I was in Nigeria, up in the Boko Haram territory, and I had a meeting with an imam and about this research with indigenous youth as we were going to be working. And after the meeting, I came. We were coming out, and he said to, or the leader was taking me around, and said, "Okay, now we have to go to a school, and we're late. We have to get there because you've got something important to do." So I went, and went over and said, "You have to open this building." And I'm standing there, and I'm looking at this white building. I said, "Well, what's the building?" Because I said, say something. I said, "What's the building?" And I said, "It's our new toilet." Now, this is a school for 700. It's been going for over 20 years. This is their first toilet, a 2-hole toilet. Up to now, they've just been using the schoolyard for defecating, urinating, and now this meant that girls could come. So I'm very important. I've had a building named after me. I have all kinds of lines I use in other companies, but this is the school band that played the national anthem. And the poor drummer, you can see the end, he had about 3 beats and the end fell off. So the teacher just quietly walked out, picked it up, came over and put it back on, and he continued on. And this little girl, so bright. We talked with her for a few minutes, and she had my wife by the hand and saying, "Please take me with you, please take me with you." You know, and the whole thing with the immigration. I was kind of stuck on my feet for what to say, but I did fall back on the, I fell back on an experience I had in New York. You often see when presentations are going on and people do the writing. And this was, we had ministers of the environment who were going on and telling how they had solved problems in India and South Africa. And right after that, UNIFEM, the world's women's, they got up and talked about the reality, that what it was like. And I can remember they were capturing what the women were saying, and in the middle of that is this. The power of the whole thing. And so when I congratulated them on what they've been able to do, it had meaning. I won't go into all the stories of how difficult it is, but more than 50% of the people in India have no toilet. And for women, you can't be seen going to the washroom during the day because you'll bring shame to your husband, for God's sake. And at night it's rape. It is a huge thing. So now the idea of microloans for toilets. Anyway, so the idea of access to primary education, and the idea is not new, but the children from wealthy schools, the wealthy parents do so much better. We have to really focus on equity and balancing out how are we going to reach children in a way. And of course the urban to rural divide is out there in the world. And so if we're going to approach that, we really need. But beyond just within our own sphere, what is so important is that we, as was pointed out on the first evening, education is key to implementing all the others, but we are never at that table. It's been proven that we can deliver public health information through our school systems at 1/10 the cost of putting public health people out into the field. We need training, yes. We don't know that much, but the system is there. How can we work together in a systemic way of to bring about more sustainable societies? So when we look at SDG 3, which is about health and well-being, and when we look at number 5 with gender equity, I mean, think of the programs in our schools that are working on gender equity. We should be seen as part of that. But we need to be involved in the planning of these at the national level. People always assume, oh, well, schools will do it. But ministers of education say, well, that's the health department. That's the environment department. And usually become a turtle. And their heads go down, the feet come up, and do everything but flip on their back and die. You know, over time, it's most of what we get done is in spite of the ministries of education, not because of them. And it's sad. That whole thing has to stop. And that bit about the workforce. The whole thing around responsible consumption. So many of your sustainability programs within schools were already working on SDG 12 was there. And the whole thing on climate. Yeah, we can't do it all, but we are part of climate reduction programs within communities. How do we link that together? And it's not just facts and figures, it's the emotional component. Look at what is happening right now in the Caribbean. Those Caribbean countries put like carbon into the atmosphere, but they're the ones who pay the price. We say, it missed Florida. Yeah. But who owns the carbon that's already up there? The developing countries are all big. Take your carbon out so we can put ours in. Totally impossible. But is there no sense of responsibility? No longer can we say we didn't know. No longer. At what point are we going to assume it is our carbon and we're sorry? And we need to do more than send you bottled water. There's so much more that really needs to be done. The amount of foreign aid that we send to places like Bangladesh, who is waiting for the next big one. the South Pacific Islands. So we need to start moving on. Now, the one bit of good news that, or another bit of good news that is that the ministers of education in Incheon, where they all met to say, okay, SDG 4 is ours, and we're going to call it Education 2030. And we are going to focus on our little narrow bit. We're not focusing on our relations to the other ministries, but we want to focus on those 7 points. And in order to say that we will do it, they have established a global monitoring, global education monitoring report that comes out each year, independently assembled within the House of UNESCO, but not under UNESCO, funded by ministries of education around the world. And the report will look at the 7 targets. One of them is already out, and it's fairly damning. The next one will be out in November, so watch for that. The Global Education Monitoring Report, this was 2016, this is 2017, and one of the big themes on it will be migration, which is totally in line with Palermo and where we are going. I'm trying to make the point that we are seen by UNESCO, and we are a very useful tool. But how do we figure out our future, and how can we move forward? Now, again, let's just back up. I want to say a few words on education for sustainable development. This 4.7, it fleshed out into a bigger space, reads, by 2030, ensure all learners, so that's preschool and higher education and lifelong learning, and all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including through education for sustainable development. And it's long ago, we made a very big distinction between education about sustainable development, which is sort of sustainability education, and education for sustainable development, using all of our education system, not a separate add-on, but using our education system, the values, the ethics, the disciplines, topics, and so on, all in a purposeful way. The idea of addressing sustainable lifestyles, human rights, and so on, and global citizenship. All of this. Now, I'll go back. The argument I'm making is that this should be embedded in the first 6, not seen as a standalone, and that I make quite a noise there in Paris from that. I have an opportunity coming up again. This is the 25th anniversary of UNESCO chairs, and I've been asked to speak at the 25th anniversary representing the world's UNESCO chairs. So I think you can hear what I'm going to be saying in the world of UNESCO, because all the ambassadors around will be sitting there. Anyway, I wanted to clarify also, for those of you who are hearing me for the first time, the idea of what is education for sustainable development. And there are these 4 overarching aspects. The first one, I made the point. It's access and retention in a quality education. And the discussion around, can you have a quality education, as one that simply has good lighting, heating, washrooms, teacher ratio of whatever. But the purpose, if one of the purposes of your education system isn't a sustainable, socially just, and equitable future for the planet, then I don't think you can really say that it's quality. Right? But that's my perception. But this access and retention, without an educated public, there will be no development, let alone sustainable development. So that's the first. The second thing, though, is recognizing it's our most educated countries that are leaving the deepest ecological and often unjust footprints in the world. So simply taking our education system as we see, as the PISA group, and imposing that on the rest of the world, it'd be great for development for a while, but it's not sustainable development. So so we have two big areas. With us, in Learning Teacher Network, we're focusing more on number two. How do we reorient education from a goal of development to a goal of sustainable development? In almost all of the countries that are represented here, we have access, but again, what is the purpose? What is the quality? And so on. So it's that reorienting factor. The third one is public awareness and understanding. This is where the NGOs, this is where our municipalities, this is so important because we can't really bring about the change without having parents on board. Right? The local authority can't bring in enlightened legislation if they're going to be voted out of office. People have to understand why we need something. The way to win any election is I'll cut your taxes. You need an educated public to realize that with the question, I'm sorry, what services are you going to cut? Because cutting taxes means cutting services. So it's that whole aspect. And the private sector, it's no good, there's no need for them to start building things that just won't sell. So all of this is extremely important. Now, another fact that has just come forward, that climate change, environmental education, these kinds of things are not mentioned in most schools. 50% of school systems. Now, I'm going to wrap up simply so we can have some time for discussions. But when you get the slides, there are about 6 more. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. This is sort of the way in which around the world things are being integrated into formal education. Unfortunately, most school systems either ignore or do very little, or they have a club, or they have Vegetarian Thursday, or something like that. Or they move into this idea of teaching about sustainable development, which more referred to more as sustainability education. But teaching for is that whole systemic purpose built in universities. If it's in the MBA, it's in architecture, it's in engineering. It's scattered through the whole thing. Or lastly, the idea of embedding ESD right into the community goals so that we bring together urban planning, the vision for the community and so on, right into the school system where teachers have access to the information on what's happening in their community and communities like them around the world. So let me stop at that point. And the question, of course, that comes forward, that I hope for the rest of the day and for your executive, and let me say how much I appreciate what the executive has done in rebirthing, there's a good name, rebirth this. In keeping the Learning Teacher Network alive and going. But I think the question then is from here on in, what part of the work of the Learning Teacher Network continues to focus on this vision of a more sustainable future, the training of people, the preparing to be leaders within your own community. So let me stop and look for some questions. And I think we probably have a mic somewhere. Oh wait, right. Well, we can't use the two of them, right? Okay. Are there questions out there? It'll be a terrible death because if you don't ask questions, I'll put up the Yes, please.
You were earlier on, what we got halfway through, it was about vast percentages of people at the university. And when Tony Blair was our Prime Minister in England, he had a target of 50% of young people to go to university. That started to happen, but then people began to think that even university education was going to be devalued because courses were being created that have received value. How do you see the sort of balance between that and the ESG agenda?
Personally, I would not put a target of 50% university. I would put a target of lifelong learning. I don't think everybody should go to university. I think at the moment, Canada has the highest percentage of people in university. But it's taken a tremendous amount of effort and work. You're probably following in the newspapers the number of students who are suffering from mental illness now. We want, what do you call it, not a guide dog, but a rescue dog, you know, for people to get even another little bit. The pressure on, and we have so many university graduates driving taxis, and we really do need to rethink the whole thing. Most of the people who are going into now to our community colleges for a trade are graduates of university. Our number one intake is people who've gone through, have a BA, now come back, start over, and are now looking for a trade. So I think that it's a good question, and something that I think again, we need a knowledgeable general public, because everyone says, I want my child to be a brain surgeon, and it's the school's fault if they're not. So I just want to shop around for my brain surgeon. Any other questions?
If there isn't, can I ask another one?
There's one at the back. If you could say it nice and loudly so everyone can hear, including, yeah.
Okay. I listened to your speech, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think about emotional intelligence as being developed as a goal for this huge vision and strategy, together with the others you mentioned, or I meant to be specifically mentioned as such. So it's okay to have like expectations, to have pupils knowing how to read and write, but I think it's more than that. If we want to attain this global sustainability and to have peace, for instance, to teach, to help them know how to communicate, how to tolerate, how to know themselves, how to work in teams, how to have their interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligences developed, how to approach art, so to bring this also into this global view. What do you think of this?
Yeah. Like yesterday, yes. Let me show, I think. Yeah, we conducted research in about 18 high-scoring PISA countries on schools that had really focused on education for sustainable development, and this research is out now. And what we found was that it did not hurt PISA, or whatever, but these are just some of the findings of where the school, and this was in in Finland, Korea, Japan, Canada. We usually rank about number 6, something like that. Australia and so on. We found that by looking at the local social, environmental, economic issues, what students were really concerned about, and so on, that it improved these factors. So that's what I'm saying, it is not either or. It is by bringing relevance into the school. But we also need to change our pedagogy. And that is what I'm trying to find now, working by going to the other extreme, from the high-performing schools to the indigenous. Okay? And so we have different in Central Asia, Andean region, Asia Pacific, North America. We're involving the LAPs, I know, because they do very, very well. I think that we will learn more, but with them, it's not only the content, it's the pedagogy, how we relate to people, how different learning styles, honoring who they are as a culture. Education is really quite complex. And the problem is that for any of us, at any one time, you've got half the kids that want you to just be their coach and are ready to fly, and the other half saying, what the hell am I doing here? I don't want to be here, and you're trying to engage them and so on. It is complex. Anyhow, I'm going to stop now because I'm right on the button, I think. Yeah.
Charles, thank you very much.